just going to talk about crop insurance in general. So what we can learn more about crop insurance, answer any questions that anybody might have, just so that everybody's knows what tools there are available to them to see what's best for their farming operation. So that's our goal for today. And I live just south of Indianapolis, close to Columbus, Indiana. And I've been in crop insurance since 2020 or 2012. And so been here a while, but I've enjoyed it. So just thought I'd try to help out as much as I can today. So Karen, if you have questions, you stop me today, okay? Okay, I'm going to share my screen. And let me know, Jenna, if you can see my PowerPoint.
It's working on it. It seems to be stuck.
A little slow. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, everybody's home from school, so the internet is,
Yeah.
so reliable in the evenings. If it's not, I can turn my video off to see if it will help. Is it loaded
You
yet?
might try that.
Okay.
There it came in once you
Okay.
did that.
Okay. So just enough.
Yep.
So what we're going to hit on today, let's see if I can go ahead and get it to advance. There we go. Okay. So first what I thought we would just do is go through the entire crop insurance cycle. So this is everything that happens to a policy and for a farmer throughout the year. And so we'll just go step by step. So that way, if anybody has any questions, we can stop and definitely have time to chat through anything and how it might be working on your farm. Okay. So first of all, we want to talk about why do we even need crop insurance? Why is this even something that's out there for everybody? And so crop insurance is a very important tool to cover losses that are unavoidable for that farmer on his ground for or her ground for adverse weather, crop qualities, yields, revenue, or any combination of those options. So why the government created crop insurance was really to help create a way for farmers to have some risk management to get from one year to the next and still be able to farm. And I can attest to that. My mom even went to DC and showed how much she had received from crop insurance and how much she'd paid in crop insurance over 20 years, and it came out to be net zero, which is the whole point of the policy. You shouldn't be making money on it, shouldn't be losing money on it. It should be helping you in those years um, to really give you that revenue to continue to farm for the next year. And so, what we're going to talk about first is what are we covering? How much are we covering? And so in crop insurance, there are lots, just like P&C insurance, there's lots of options, lots of things you can pick and choose from. But we're going to highlight some of the most popular plans tonight. And so one of those is covering for row crops, corn and beans. So Karen, I'm not sure if you're a corn and bean farmer or if you have other crops on your operation.
Yeah, we are solely corn and beans.
Okay, well, this is right up your alley then. So, what this policy is covering is yields, and it can also cover revenue. And so, what we have on the left is the expected revenue or yield. So, we're going to talk about how do we come up with what our revenue thresholds are, and then how much we're going to cover them. So you can see in the orange that there are deductibles. So just like P&C, there's a deductible off of your total value of your crop, just like there is a deductible off the entire value of your vehicle. And then we're going to talk about what is actually covered and how do we go through the life cycle with that amount of coverage. There is also other options of insurance that is pretty common for Indiana, and that can be for livestock as well. So I didn't want to exclude that in case anybody hops on, Jenna, that it's not just corn and beans. There are policies for every crop under the sun, and for livestock as well. But we're going to hit on row crops for this evening. Okay. So the first question is who do we even buy it from? So first we have on the left, we have the farmer. They have to make the choice to purchase the insurance. And so who they're going to work with or who they're going to seek out is an agent. So that agent is the person that's actually going to help them write the policy, just like you have a PNC insurance agent. One thing about a crop insurance agent, though, is not everybody can be a crop insurance agent. You have to take special training for that. You have to do continuing education. You have to be licensed with the government to be able to do that. And how an agent actually does that is they write with an insurance company, just like you would have, Grinnell Mutual, you'd have Farm Bureau, you'd have any of these other companies. There are specific companies for crop insurance as well. And that's where I work. I work for the actual company that helps provide the policy to the agent who then sells it to the farmer. And then you might say, well, how do you come up with all your rules for insurance? Well, we get all of those directly from the government. So just like you would have rules for your auto insurance, you have rules you have to follow for your crops. And that is all set by the USDA, which I'm sure you're very familiar with that acronym. But then also the sub agency under USDA is called RMA, and that is the Risk Management Agency. And that is all they do is work on policies and language and rules for crop insurance specifically. And then if you've ever had a claim, you would work directly with an adjuster from the company that would work directly with the farmer to determine if you have payable losses. So just like you may have worked with somebody for an auto claim, you would work with the company directly for a crop insurance claim. Okay. Any questions on that one before we move on? Okay. You just stop me, Karen, if you've got questions. Okay. So the next thing we're going to talk about is a little bit of a breakdown of all the different kinds of insurance that are available to farmers. And in the top, you would see federal crop insurance. So that's where we talk about the Risk Management Agency. Those are the products that are written into law that they can provide. And those are administered to the companies through what we call an SRA. So that's more for row crops. And then the LPRA, that's the livestock. So there's different sets of rules for different plans. And we're going to focus on the one that's highlighted in orange, which is called MPCI. That's multi-peril crop insurance. So I don't know if you have ever heard that term, Karen. Most people don't, but that's where we're talking about specific row crops and different plans that are available. Other plans that you may have heard of or seen before are what the second one, which is called private products. So those are actually not administered through the government. Those are products that the insurance companies have developed on their own. So they can be a little different from one company to the other. Where the federal crop insurance is, it doesn't matter where you buy it, who you buy it from, it is the same. We're all using the same handbooks. Private products, that can be different because those are not have any oversight from the government. So a lot of farmers in Indiana do have that MPCI plan that we're talking about that's subsidized by the government. But then sometimes they also purchase a crop hail policy. And a crop hail policy is just like it says, it's covering you from storms, hail, and things that are not covered under the government program. It could be theft, it can be vandalism. Somebody drives out in your field, somebody, you have a tornado hit your grain bin. It's not actually in the field anymore. Those policies are out there as well. Okay. So there are, like I said, a lot of options of things to pick from, but we're going to pick on the most popular plan in Indiana. So how we would pick a plan is we're doing that right now. So agents are sitting down with farmers because we have to buy our insurance before we get into the growing season. So all of those selections of what we're going to buy have to be made by March 15th. And those are for row crops in Indiana. Different states, different crops have different deadlines across the year and across the nation, but we're going to focus on revenue protection. And 82% of Indiana buys this type of policy. So, I mean, it is the policy that I'm sure that most everyone's talking about. This is the one they're talking about. And the reasoning for that is that it gives you individual coverage for your farm, and it's covering not only a yield loss, but it's also taking into account prices. So it's also covering you for revenue as well, which is what we've seen a lot in the last couple years is more the prices haven't been great. Maybe our yields are still good, but the prices may not have been great. So that's why it's the most popular option out there. As we go over to the right, there are other options out there. So there are some, revenue exclusion policies. There's also some area plan policies that you are banking on what the county does. And then there are some like yield only policies, but you can see why that one is so popular. Okay. So you might say, okay, we're covering revenue, but how do we know what price to use or what yield to use? So what we focus on for revenue protection is every year you have to take the amount of bushels that you harvest and give those to your agent. That agent then keeps a list of all of those bushels over 10 years. And so that's how we're kind of coming up with what our personal farm history is we're taking all those 10 years that we've produced that crop and we're adding them all together, and then we're dividing by the number of acres that we've had each year. And so that helps us determine what our bushels are per acre. And so for Indiana, depending on what county or even within a county, the kind of soil you have or different genetics, things of that sort can affect what your history is. So after we haul it all off to the elevator or put it all in a bin and measure it, and we divide that by the number of acres, we get our average per acre. And so in this example, we're going to have 200 bushel of corn history per acre. And so that's how we start. The baseline is what does that farm normally make over 10 years? And then that's our average to start with on how we set our insurance. So with 200 bushels of corn history, then we're going to multiply that times a price. You might be like, well, how does the government know what price I'm selling my grain at? They have no idea. And that's a good thing. But what we do is, so since the government has no idea what the farmer is actually selling their grain at, they pick a month and they take the average of that month to set what the price will be for crop insurance. So we are in that month right now. That is set during the month of February. And so it's looking at the Chicago Board of Trade over the month on the December's futures to come up with an average price for insurance. So right now, we're almost done. coming up with that price. But as of today, that price is $4.60. So if we take our average over 10 years and we multiply that times that price the government's trending right now of $4.60, that means we have $920 worth of crop per acre is basically what the government's looking at it as. Like you have $920 that's going to sit out in that field come spring. And then I also put in the average cost, and this is by the corn growers. It's just the average cost of what they think it will cost a farmer to produce corn in Indiana. So it's an average across the state, and that's about $916 an acre. So that's a good thing that what we're covering is covering at least the cost of producing that acre of corn. Then here on beans, same thing. History of our bean bushels would be 50 bushels an acre. And that price that we're trending right now is $11.05. And so they're thinking there'll be $552 worth of protection out there on that farm. Of your crop value would be $552. The average cost of producing soybeans this year is around $600. So you can see here why some people can get frustrated with crop insurance setting a price over 1 month is because, we're not even technically covering our cost of producing that crop. And it changes every year. So we just have to take that with a grain of salt. And then we have to look at, okay, so we know how much it was in the spring, but how much is it going to actually value my bushels at fall? So the government's actually going to look at what they call the harvest price. And so that's looking during the month of September, looking at the harvest price for the same crops. So it's going to do the whole thing again, but in the fall. So let's say that comes in at $5 for corn. That means we're going to take that $5 with the revenue protection plan, and it's going to substitute in $5 for this $4.60. So we get the better of the two. So that's why this policy is so popular. The other policies don't take that into account. That if at the fall the price is higher, we get more insurance basically for the same price. It doesn't cost anything more to bump up this $900 to, $1,000 an acre. Okay. And I have 2 buckets because I always like to say, a bushel is about 2 5-gallon buckets, so that's always a good way to remember it. But that's how much, you're holding 2 5-gallon buckets, and that's worth $4.60. Okay. Any questions? I know that was a lot of math, but I just kind of wanted to show how we came up with how we're covering each acre. Okay, the next thing that we have to do, so this is all at March 15th, we have to pick what plan. So we're going to pick revenue protection. Now we have to pick another important element, and that is units. If you ever talk to anybody, if you ever meet with your insurance agent, have them explain to you units, because it is literally the hardest part of the whole policy. So the reason it's so hard is because it's different by crop. So when you buy a crop insurance policy, you're buying one policy on corn and you're buying another policy on beans. So they're never adding the two together. They're 2 separate crops with 2 separate policies. But it's hard as a farmer because you're thinking corn and beans together all the time. So the different ways you can have units is there are what they call basic units. Basic units is like, these are all the farms I farm 100% myself. And then all the farms that I may farm 50-50 with a landlord, those are grouped differently. We're going to keep our acres and our bushels separately between the two. That you can also choose to insure all of your crop in the county together. You know, like I just want to deliver all my corn in the county together, and that's going to be called an enterprise unit. Then we have what we call enterprise units by practice, where it's like I'm going to group all my irrigated acres together and all my non-irrigated acres together. And then we have what we call optional units. So we're going to separate it out, your bushels, by the people you farm with, like 50-50 or 100% yourself. And then we're also going to break out your fields by what section they're in. So I don't know if you've ever seen a plat book, Karen, but it is, yep, all different sections. You're going to pick what crop you're planting, what section it's in, what people you're, insuring it with, and then what different kinds of practices. So it really breaks it down. And the reason that this is such a big selection is the more specific your units are, the more broke down they are by section and people and crop and practice, it costs more because you're really insuring a small group of fields at a time separately. And then the more you throw them together into like an enterprise unit where it's all the crop in the county, that's a lot less risk, right? You're spreading it across different areas. And so that's why it's a lot cheaper. It's because there's less likely to be a loss because your good fields might outproduce your not so great fields. And so that's always good to talk with your agent to see what unit structure you have so you're prepared for the types of claims you could be getting. And then there's also some newer policies that are more like umbrella policies. So like you could have an umbrella farm policy where, it's like, hey, I'm just going to throw an extra $1 million on top of just everything I've already insured specifically for your farm. There's also the same types of policies for row crops. So we have revenue protection is covering that specific crop, your bushels. And then there's umbrella policies called enhanced coverage option or ECO. And that is in every farm magazine, every news article right now, because the government is giving a discount for those. And it's an umbrella policy on the county. So it doesn't matter what happens to your farm. It matters what happens to the whole county as a whole. And so that's become popular just in the last few years. So this is where we would see an example here would be optional units. It's so if I had 20% damage just on my fields in this section as an optional unit, I could get paid just on this one field. But if I'm over here and I'm grouping all my crop in the county together and I have one field that has an 80% damage, but all these other fields did great, if I harvest them all together and it's over that 200 bushels, I don't have a claim. You're spreading your risk out. Okay, so you might say, okay, now I know how I want my units. I know I want revenue protection. Now I gotta have to decide how much of that revenue do I actually want to cover. So in crop insurance, you can pick coverage levels between 50% to 85% for your revenue protection policy. So if we have an example where we had 180 bushels as our history on that farm, and we multiply that times the spring price like we did before, but since we have a little bit lower of a 10-year history, that means we have a little bit lower amount of revenue that's being covered. So in this instance, there's $828. That's how much my crop is worth for crop insurance wise. But I can only insure at the maximum 85% of that. So that means I can only insure $703 of that crop out in the field. So that is over here. That's showing you for 85%, you can cover $703, but you still have that 25% deductible here, 15% deductible. Then if we also have here at 75%, you can choose lower, anywhere between 50 and 85. I'm like, nope, that's that's going to maybe cost me a little too much. I don't want to spend that much on insurance. You can always choose to lower how much of that amount of coverage you want to insure. And there's not a most popular one of those. That's just very dependent on each farmer. I will say most farmers don't go below 75 or 70. And the reasoning for that is because this is a government program, they do cover some of the costs or the premiums for crop insurance. And a lot of that they cover really for the return of what you're getting from them is the best between 70 and 75. So nobody goes below that because they're just giving up coverage and it costs the same as 70 and 75. So don't, just always look at that part. Okay. So after we get done picking what we want for the year, we know how much coverage we want. Now, that's all done in March. Then comes around July. We're going to go through the whole planting season, get everything in the ground. Then we have to turn around and tell the FSA office, what we planted. And then we also have to tell our crop insurance agent what we planted because, we assumed you were planting certain fields to certain crops, but did that actually happen? Or were there changes you had to make or anything like that? So we have to tell our agent where all of our acres are, or what all of our acres are planted to by July 15th. And so that's where we take that revenue amount and we're going to take it times the number of acres we have, and then we're going to take it times that coverage level to get us our total amount of insurance. So a lot of times agents will have you go to the FSA office first, fill out the maps, put what crop, what the plant date is, and that fills out an FSA 578. They sometimes give you maps. Sometimes your agents can give you maps. But what you have to report on the acreage report is you want to make sure you know what crops you've planted, how many exact acres did you plant. You also have to know the farm number. So the FSA office, that's why a lot of agents use the 578 is because the FSA has to tell you what your farm number is called. You also have to have your track number, and then you also have to have your field number. You have to have it listed if it's like irrigated or non-irrigated, or if it's first crop beans, or if it's second crop beans after wheat. You have to tell them that. You have to tell them the date it's planted and what your share is of the crop. So if you're 100% share, it's put 100%. If you're farming 50-50 with somebody else, you have to mark all that so that you don't get overcharged for your insurance. And then once you're done reporting all of your acres, what we have to do next is, now that we know how many acres you have and how much your coverage is, then we actually know how much your insurance costs. So it's kind of weird because like when you buy car insurance, you have to pay your premium right off the bat. Crop insurance is different because we do have to wait for the acres to be planted. You have insurance the moment that crop is put in the ground, but you don't pay for it until the fall. And so that's always I'm like, man, that's really a nice thing to have, is you don't have to buy it up front. You really get to pay for it after you actually start knowing how much of a crop you have. So normally bills for crop insurance will go out in August or September. And farmers have until October 1st to pay that bill without any interest. So July, you get your acres in. We normally give the agent, since they're normally reporting lots of farmers' acres, they need a couple weeks to get it all in. So those bills will come out August, September, and then they give you 30 days, just like any other normal bill, to October 1st to pay without any interest. Some years the government does extend that. So not last year, but 2 years prior to that, due to some of the relief, they were like, hey, we won't charge you interest till November. But just always keep October 1st in your brain, because that's That's what it's supposed to be. And then you can not pay it on October 1st. You know, like some farmers like to wait till they've hauled some grain in to then pay that bill. That's perfectly fine. They will have interest on there every month. They'll get additional interest, but they have to pay the bill before the next application. So you have to pay it before March 15th of the next year, or at least come up with a payment agreement for it. And then subsidy. So a lot of times on the bill, you'll see this giant premium amount, and you're like, holy moly, that's a lot of dollars. But that's the part that is the total. That's what it's called, gross premium. That is what the whole policy would cost. So the government really likes to show that full amount and then show you how much they're covering of that bill. And so, like we were talking about before, these are what we call our subsidy factors. So if you're in an enterprise unit, that's where you're doing all the crop in the county. So at 50% coverage level, they're covering 80% of the bill. 55%, they're covering 80. You know, all the way up to 75%, they're covering 80% of the bill. So you can see why guys don't really drop below that, because the subsidy's the same. So that's your biggest bang for your buck. But then a lot of guys also look up and they're like, well, that's not a lot of bushels, or that's not a lot of money that's protected. So then they start looking at, okay, let's go to an 80% coverage level. The government will cover a little less of that bill, but still a significant amount. And then the higher you go, the less the government's willing to cover your bill. Optional units, that's the one where it's the most specific. It's by section, by people, by crop. And you can see, you know, where the government's willing to pay more for all the crop of the county thrown together versus everything being split out by section. So that can affect the premium as well. And every farmer is different. If you have very different ground, you know, wet ground, dry ground, you know, kind of all over the place with soil types, optional units might be worth the extra money. If your ground is flat, it all produces about the same, then it might be more advantageous to take a cheaper bill, but have a little less risk and do enterprise units and have it all thrown together, the crop of the county. And so that is a personal decision for each farmer.
So
Okay.
do you have to insure all of your acreage, or can you, just split out, I just want to cover this one field?
Yeah, that's a great question. Very good question. I should have covered that. So the way it works is that for the government to do that, you have to insure all of the crop in the county. Because if we just picked the real bad fields, then it would cost so much for everyone, because only the people that had, if you're next to the river, only those guys might buy insurance. And so that's why the government's like, if you want to participate in the program, it does have to be all the crop in the county. Yep. The only time there are fields are what we call not insurable is when, like, maybe you're doing an experimental plot for Purdue, or you're farming ground that maybe was strip mined and not really viable for that first couple of years. There are specific instances, but those are very, very few and far between to ever not be insurable. Yeah. Or if you're doing something out of the ordinary, like I'm planting wheat inside of, an apple orchard, or something like that. But just our normal corn and bean fields, yep, all of them have to be in there. That's a great question, because that would be lovely if we could pick. Oh, yeah. Okay, so now that we've picked our plan, we've reported our acres, now we have to worry about what if we have a claim. So there are different kinds of claims. So the first kind that we can come across is what we call a replant claim. So if you go out there, plant your corn, it rains real hard, floods the field out, and it's just not looking great. If you do have replant coverage, so we will pay you to replant your crop, because it's better to replant it and get a good yield than to let a crappy stand sit out there and not get very many bushels. So the one thing that you have to remember about claims with the government is they want to know. The moment you have the car crash, they want to know. And before you go get it fixed, you better tell somebody. So it's real hard for guys to wait, or anybody out there planting, that once that rain hits, they're like, yep, I got to replant. I go get my seed. I'm filling the planter. Once it stops, we're going to go get back in there. You just have to take a breath. Always have your agent on speed dial. Be like, hey, I have some not great stands. I don't even know if I'm going to replant. Call your agent while it's still wet and you can't get in there yet. Because what they need to do is they need to send an adjuster out there to be like, is it worth replanting? Most every time they'll let you go ahead and replant. But they sometimes will send somebody out there, especially if you're going to like disc it up and then plant it again. Then they really need to come see it to prove, if you ever had a claim that got reviewed, like, yep, this picture, it's flooded out, then it's no questions asked. Next we have is prevent plant. So let's say it starts raining and it just never stops raining. So that was very common. The last large prevent plant year we've had is 2019. So it's been a little while, but it does happen. And so we have a window, what's called our final plant date. So there is a date that the government's like, yep, this is the time that we think you should start planting, and this is the time when we think you should probably end planting. And so once we get past that date of when they think you should quit planting, then you can claim prevent plant. Like, it's just never, if I plant it now, I'm not even going to make any money, That's when you definitely if you have any of those thoughts that you may not plant that field, call your agent right away, because there are a lot of rules around prevent plant that they need to go over with you. A lot of times there's eligibility. Like, sometimes you have to know, can I take it on this field, or can I not? Then we have if it's planted and failed. So let's say we planted some wheat, and it looked awful in the spring. So we're deciding we're going to chisel plow it under and we're going to plant some beans. That's called a failed crop. And so if you're tearing anything up, again, don't let anybody tear anything up till you tell somebody, just so that they can get those pictures taken, prove it, and then they're ready to roll on. Then also if we have planted and then we have a bushel loss. So let's say we have a drought. The moment you're like, hey, this corn does not look great. It's curling up. It's not, but 6-7 feet tall. It's, anything like that. Go ahead and turn in a claim with your agent, because you can always withdraw a claim. If it, they come out and like, yep, you had too many bushels. It may have been a little drouthy, but it still yielded great, then we can always withdraw the claim, but you can't add it after the car crash, basically. And then when we talk about when we were setting those harvest prices, in October, that's when we're going to know, is there a revenue loss? So if that spring price, let's say, is $4.60 right now, and we get to the fall, and for whatever reason, tariffs or, there's just a lot of crop out there that they didn't take into account. We have a large corn reserve, then that could drive the price down. So if we have like a $4.60 this spring, but this fall it's $4.20, well, that's a drop in revenue. So we're going to take our yields that we actually produced, multiply it times that harvest price to see how much money that is, to see if that's below that $900 guarantee we were talking about earlier, or that $800 guarantee, depending on your coverage level. So a lot of times agents will call and ask you, how do your yields look? Because then they can calculate the drop in price to be like, yep, that's probably enough to trigger a claim. And they use tools like this. It's called a revenue trigger chart. And they're just taking your 10-year history. They've already put the prices in here. And then based off your coverage level, they're recalculating what those new bushels need to be to trigger a loss. Okay. So if you get to December and your agent has not called you to ask you how your yields are, you need to call them and tell them what your yields are. Because we don't want to be too late that we can't pay it. So then if you have a claim, this is what the adjuster is going to do, is they're going to probably call you, be like, hey, here, you might have a claim. Be like, yep, I'm not done harvesting. Nope. And they'll say, okay, call me when you're done. And what they're going to do is they're going to look at, these are different units, these are different sections that ground could be in. These are the number of acres that are in those different sections. Some are non-irrigated, some are irrigated. These are called your units, and then those acres that are in those units. And here's that guarantee. So here's that history. So like a 140, we got a 75% coverage level. This is what our bushel guarantees are. Here's the total bushel guarantees for the number of acres. So we're taking that 105 times the 34 acres. So now we've got 3,644 total bushels. Production to count. And then what was the deficit? What are we below? And then what's our share? So on an enterprise unit where we're looking at all these, grouping them together, we have 2 units that look like they could pay a claim. And then we have 1 unit that's a negative. So that must have been our really good field, that we didn't want to buy insurance on. And it's going to actually work against us. So, here we've got all this money that we can be paying you. Here's the one field that was good. We do have to take that into account. That's why it's cheaper to buy enterprise units, because it's grouping them all together. And then it comes up with your total amount that they can pay you. So that's what they really need to know, is know your bushels so that they can tell if you have a claim. Okay. So once we're done having our claim, let's say we didn't have a claim. So nobody actually, like, nope, we've had bumper crops. You don't have to send anybody out. Well, that's great. But you still have to talk to your agent about what your bushels were for the year, because remember, they're going to use all those bushels to create that 10-year history. So every year we have to tell them what those bushels are. A lot of times they'll call in the winter because, they're already talking to you about if they had a claim, or they might talk to you when they're signing an app up, like, hey, let's go ahead and look at your bushels from the last year. But the last day that they can ask you about bushels is actually April 29th. And so I'm always like, it's better to report your bushels when it's in the winter, you're doing your taxes. I'm always like, once you're doing your taxes, pull out all your settlement sheets. But sometimes they wait till April, and you might be like, why do they wait so long? Well, sometimes it's like, let's go ahead, whatever we put in the bin, we might want to go ahead and haul it out and sell it. So it's just a little easier to come up with those bushels. So what you have to be able to tell them is, what was the crop? What was the practice? What unit did it come from? What section was it in? A lot of times they'll use farm names. If you have a name for each farm, go ahead and tell them that. So it makes it a little easier to connect once you're filling out these reports. So then, if you had 2,000 bushels sold to the elevator off 10 acres, you're going to have 200 bushels an acre. So if I had, in my past, I had an average of 180, well, if there wasn't a revenue drop, then I don't have a claim, because I had 200 bushels an acre and my average for my insurance is 180. So if you have questions on that, sometimes they do have adjusters to come out and measure bins. The one thing I will say that is always important is, if you do have quite a bit of farm storage, some farmers hold their grain for more than 1 year. always have somebody come check the bushels that are still in your bin before you start the next year's harvest. Because you don't want all those bushels to get thrown together at a claim, because if it's old bushels and we don't know there's old bushels, we need to be able to subtract those out. Okay. And then next, what we have is we have changes. So every year, the government has the opportunity to change the policy. Some years they do, some years they don't. That is why your agent has to go through training every year before they get to the next sales season or the next crop season. So things that they can change is they could change how the products work. They could change dates or change rates. Like if a county hasn't had a lot of losses in the last 10 years, your county will actually have what they call a lower rate. So it will cost you less for the same amount of insurance from one year to the next. Just like if you don't crash your car every year, you'll have a lower rate. Same scenarios. But that's why a lot of times agents meet with their farmers every year, is because if something's changed, they want to be able to talk with them. Just like the ECO, that umbrella plan, being a newer policy, they're probably coming out and talking to you about those. Okay, so we talked about application, we talked about reporting your acres, what to do if you have a claim, which is pretty much call anybody for anything, and then report your bushels, and then learn about what's new. So then a few things I wanted to hit on too, as we get closer to time here, is what can I do as a farmer? So I'm a farmer as well. And, I have to remind myself all these things as well, is what can I do to make my policy as solid as I can now before we get into a crop year, so that there's not any troubles when somebody's trying to pay you a claim. Because it is the government. They do have lots of rules. But it's not too bad. We can do it. Is the first thing is always tell your agent if something's changing in your farming operation. If somebody gets married, somebody gets divorced, somebody creates an LLC, somebody creates a corporation, somebody creates a trust. Those are really popular right now. You always want to update your agent on how you're going to sell your grain. So like in my family, my father's passed, my mother created a trust. So she has to make sure that she switches everything over to this trust. And so, she's got to remember, I got to tell my crop insurance agent that too. And this is just a very convoluted spreadsheet, but this is all the different options that are out there to be able to pick from. And then it talks about how you can sign them, documents you might need to prove, like an LLC or a trust, or who can sign for one of those entities. Because the adjuster will have to know, like, okay, if you're an LLC, who's actually allowed to sign that document. Okay. Also, the other thing that we have to have on our application is that named insured. So the person you're marking down is, so let's say you create an LLC. Let's say it's White Family Farms LLC, and it's care of John White. What you also have to make sure you do is, if you have your insurance policy under White Family Farms LLC, you also have to sell your grain that way. So if you're making any changes, or if you have an entity now, or and then like just under your own name, Karen, if you're selling just under Karen, make sure it's Karen at the policy, it's Karen at the FSA office, and then it's Karen at the elevator. The one that's the hardest is when it's LLCs, because somebody forgets to leave, might say White LLC. They might not spell it all out. You want to make sure those are very clear as to we have the coverage under the right person, basically. If you have LLCs, you also have to list who is in the LLC. Anybody over 10%. So if that's quite a few family members, make sure you have all of them listed with their social security numbers. And I know it sounds weird to have to ask for social security numbers, but the only reason that we ask for them is because if you have any FSA payments or things like that, that's how they link it together, is by your EIN number or your social security number. So that's how they track it. And then have a list of who can sign for an LLC or a corporation. Okay. This was just to show that we would want to make sure that our 578 at the FSA office is matching how we're selling our grain. And that causes a lot of trouble. So if that's something you can do in the winter, and you can just go ahead and call the elevator and be like, are all my tickets showing the right name? That's something to easily get out of the way now before we get to the fall and we forget, like I would. Okay. Oh, something happened here. There. Oh, it ended. Okay. Those are the big things to help when we have an insurance policy. Karen, do you have any questions? We hit a lot in here.
You're right. It was a lot, but I mean, I've got a pretty good handle on it.
Oh, good, good. Yeah. Do you have any questions or had any thing that you might wonder about for crop insurance for this coming year that I could be helpful for?
I don't think so.
Okay. Well, that's great. Well, Jenna, that is the rest of my PowerPoint presentation.
Okay. Well, thank you, Michelle, for joining us. I did record it, so the two that missed it, they can watch it and catch up and everything. I'm gonna throw one question at you because I know one of them that didn't make it does silage. So any
Oh,
thoughts on silage?
yes, that is a great, great thing to bring up. So if anybody has silage, just like we talked about reporting our production, we have to have our bushels. Well, it's kind of hard to do that when we're chopping it for silage. So what they have to do is make sure that they turn in a claim before they start chopping, like a week or two before. So that way the adjuster can call them and set up a time to come appraise that field. So what they'll do is they'll take a measurement, they'll grab, the ears of corn that are already there. They have a whole chart and weight method to convert that back to bushels, dry it down to give them a yield. So be sure that they turn that in before they chop, because once they chop, there's nothing to look at or leave strips. But they definitely want to talk to the adjuster about that.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us. Hopefully you can enjoy the rest of your evening. And it sounded like your kiddos are agreeing with having you online. Mine, not so much. But we're going to see how this works out.
Yeah. No, it was great. Well, it was very nice to meet you, Karen, and hopefully this was of good value. And if you guys ever have crop insurance questions, you're always welcome to reach out.
All right. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you, guys. We'll see you later.
Yep. Okay, so I've been in contact with Meredith. She was the one that was going to join us late, and she is on her way. So,
Okay.
but we will go ahead and get started with the next part. Or do you want a stretch break or anything, or do you want to keep going?
It doesn't matter. I'm good to keep going.
Okay. So we'll go ahead and keep going. So either I messed up or the other speaker messed up, but I thought I was supposed to be in RCS tonight, and they're like, "No, I'm next week." So we're switching. we're gonna do land leases tonight.
Okay.
instead. So I did send, I believe, the land lease stuff to you guys late. If not, I'll
I
send
got
it
it.
in the. Okay, you did. Okay. So I'll kind of go through the PowerPoint, but then I have some websites to show you that I think are more valuable than some of the things on the PowerPoint. Um, but we'll get started with that.
Okay.
So I'll share this. And let's see, get it in the right view. Here we go. And I told Meredith that she gets on here and I don't notice her in the waiting room to bug me. So,
Okay.
so Purdue does have a land lease team, which is made up of educators across the state. I've been a part of it almost the entire time I've been in extension, and so we do a variety of programs throughout the year. But tonight I kind of want to talk about trends, some type of row crop leases. Since I think I shared the other day, I am also wearing a soil and water hat. So I always try when I talk about land leases to do a little bit of education on how to incorporate conservation into a lease. Touch briefly on pasture leases, a little bit on communication, because that is always a key thing to stress when we're doing land lease presentations. And then it doesn't have a bullet on here, but I do want to show you those resources tonight. So a little bit about trends. We cannot find data on exactly how the percentage of farmland acres that are rented in Indiana specifically, but you can see over the last like 60 years as a nation, we've usually rented or have leased out anywhere from 37 to 42% of the farmland. So there's a lot of leases going on every year that everyone's negotiating and discussing. Our assumption is that most likely, if you were able to find the Indiana specific data, the percentages are probably very similar between the U.S. as a whole and Indiana as a state. There you go. So it is a good time to look at leases because, as we know, prices are very volatile. We've got really high inputs. Crop prices are low. So one of the areas that some farms can look at is maybe by lowering some of their leases because they have possibly a little bit more control over that than what they do on the input side of things. Also, there's great variability in cash rent and land values within regions and across time. Also, we're seeing more absentee or long distance landowners that may or may not want to have involvement in the farm. But it's a good time to maybe just meet with those absentee landowners or long distance landowners to build those relationships so that when we're having times where we're kind of got that high input, low crop prices, we can push towards a lower lease that might help during those kind of iffy times. And one of the things that I did want to share, and this is from Iowa State, it's their ag decision maker. And, there's constantly decisions going on in the farm that needs to be discussed and decided on. And so I just like showing this because we show this to a lot of non-farming individuals, but also to the farm families, just thinking about all the decisions you make, when it happens. And everything. The one thing I will say that is different, and I haven't figured out how to fix this slide, is it says Iowa lease begins in March. That would not be accurate for Indiana. Ideally, every lease is in writing and you have a start and end date and have information on when termination notice needs given. But in Indiana, traditionally, our leases do not start in March. So, Indiana does allow for verbal leases. That is not the ideal situation, so we do recommend having everything in writing and not leaving it up to that verbal discussion. Because when we leave it up to the verbal discussion, what usually ends up being an issue ends up being like, when should termination notice be given and how long was the lease really for? And so that's why putting it in writing kind of avoids that whole when does the lease start and when does it end discussion. So a few types of row crop leases. Traditionally, we see cash leases, crop share leases, and flexible cash leases. A lot of them are mostly cash leases. We are seeing more flexible cash leases, and there are still some crop share leases out there that individuals do have. With a cash lease, essentially the tenant pays all the costs except for the land ownership costs. Those are paid by the landowner. The tenant then receives all crop and government payments. Landowner receives a fixed rental amount. The tenant's taking all the price and yield risk in this case. Essentially, they're going to meet. They're going to decide, okay, the landowner wants to receive this amount of money. Maybe we'll do a split payment, some in the spring, some in the fall. Maybe it's one payment. But we set that down and the landowner knows exactly what they're getting. So with this one, there's definitely less managerial input needed by the landowner. You just have to decide what is that price going to be that you're going to ask. You don't have to really worry about what's the cost of actually growing the crops. You don't have to market anything. And it's less confusion with multiple landowners because it's just like, we're getting this amount of money. And then if there's, say, siblings that own the land, they can split the income however they want. For the tenant, there is still some advantages to it. They have relative freedom in making any managerial decisions that they may have. If they are really good at, forward contracting or locking in good prices and things for their crop, they get all that benefit of their knowledge. If they're really good at producing a crop and get a higher yield out of that land, they get that benefit. No one else gets that. They don't have to keep track of all the receipts and all of that to explain that to a landowner. They just have to have it for their records and when they go to handle their taxes. So those are some of the advantages for the tenant. On the landowner side, there still is some disadvantages. The big one, and it's kind of a disadvantage for both parties, is trying to figure out what rate to charge or what rate to pay. Usually we get a lot of phone calls in the extension office on an annual basis from landowners who call and they want to know what the going rate is. So we always have to explain to them we can't give them the magic number. I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but that is a common question because everyone leans on us to give them the going rate. And they're, we can give them ranges. If the landowner really does want to have some involvement in the production of the crop, they don't have that if they're doing a cash lease because they've pretty much given their right up to that. They're just owning the land. And so one of the disadvantages that we sometimes see is that some landowners don't necessarily know what the yield is. And so they don't, when they're trying to decide what rate to charge, and we're talking, well, is it high quality ground or low quality ground or just average? A lot of times they have no clue because they're not involved in the production, so they don't have the production information. And so we do try to encourage tenants. You may not want to tell them exactly what you got every year in terms of yield, but if you could give them a range, like over the last 5 years, we've kind of averaged around 200 bushels per acre, or we've averaged around 190 bushels per acre, something like that. So they have an idea. That's kind of helpful when you go to talk to them. With the tenant, they are taking on all the risk. So that is a downside for them when they do a cash lease. Also, cash rents tend to go up as crop yields and revenue increases. Not always true, but that is a possibility. They are putting up front all the capital costs. They're paying for all the production. They're paying, all that rent, especially if they do half the rent at the beginning of the year and half at the end. They've got a lot of capital invested compared to the landowner. So I've kind of alluded to it. Some of the challenges with the cash lease is trying to set that right rent, and we'll discuss that a little bit more later on. There's also a challenge when it comes to thinking about fertility. So hopefully no one ever does this, but unfortunately we do see this in the case that it may be that there's been a long relationship between two families and the farmer or the tenant has farmed the ground for several years, but they've never really talked to the landowner about soil fertility. And they've really pushed the production levels, and they essentially use up all of that built up for fertility in the ground and deplete some of the nutrients and things. And so then after they've depleted it and they know they've depleted it, they decide they don't want to rent that ground anymore. They want to go somewhere else. And so what happens then is the soil fertility is low, the landowner's left with not as good of soil as what they thought, and so that can be an issue. So having some discussions about making sure that we're maintaining soil fertility is important. And then I kind of already touched a little bit on the fact that with landowners, with the cash lease, they don't necessarily know much about farm productivity. And so having a discussion is really important so that they have a little idea of what's going on. Some don't want to know, but some do want to have some idea. So the next type of lease we're going to talk about is the crop share lease. And in this case, usually the tenant and landowner share some of the variable cost. So like seed, fertilizer, and pesticide. The tenant pays the remaining portion of the variable costs, provides the labor, fuel, hauling, machinery ownership costs, things like that. The landowner pays the land ownership cost, and then the landowner will receive a share of the crop as rent. Some landowners like to take possession of the crop and actually do their own marketing. Some will actually say, no, I want my tenant to market it and just give me a percentage of the money. And as far as what percentage that could be, we may have 1/3, 2/3 leases. We may have 50-50. You have to really sit down and discuss that and determine which type of a split you're going to do and kind of do some math. So in this type of a lease, there is a price and yield risk that is shared between both parties and not one party really bearing all of that risk. So like the cash lease, there is some advantages to this for the landowner. They have the potential to receive some of the gains when we get high yields or high prices because they will have possession of the crop at some point possibly or receive some of the income from that crop. They're going to be receiving some more crop productivity records. If you decide to invest in capital improvements such as tile or irrigation, they're going to receive that benefit. And if they work with a tenant that's got some great managerial skills, they're going to receive that benefit of that tenant's knowledge and skills where they wouldn't have received that if they'd done just a generic cash lease. And I don't mean cash leases are generic, they're just a lot more common. So if they're taking on some risk, they're getting some of those benefits of it. With the tenant, their advantage is that if we have low prices or low yields, they're sharing some of that risk. They're not bearing that all up themselves. They're sharing it with the landlord. They don't necessarily have to pay for all the capital because they don't have to necessarily pay for all of the seed. They may split it or split that cost up. And they also don't have to do no upfront cash payment like we would with a cash rent if they decide that they're wanting a split payment of that rent. There are, again, some disadvantages. So for the landowner, the disadvantages is their income is variable. With the cash lease, they know they're going to get $250 an acre. And that's what it is. But with this one, they have to wait till the crop grows and is harvested and sold. Again, they may have to make some marketing decisions if they choose to actually take ownership of the grain and sell it themselves. They may get a lower return in some years because we know prices can be low. They have more capital tied up than with a cash lease because they're having to share some of those production costs. There needs to be a higher degree of trust with the tenant because you guys are having to monitor expenses and track stuff and agree on things. So there has to be more communication, and sometimes that can be a little bit difficult for people. The tenant if we've got high yields or high prices, they're going to have to share some of that profit now with the landlord. Again, we got to go back to that record keeping. They're going to have to keep track of things, make sure they're splitting things equal. They're going to possibly have to talk more with the landlord when they're trying to make cropping decisions. Some landlords will still let the tenant really take the lead. Some may want to have more involvement. It really just depends, and you kind of just have to decide what works for you. I will say that it seemed like years ago these were kind of going away, and then now they're kind of coming back. I'm hearing more and more of them each year. There are some challenges, and I've kind of alluded to them in terms of what is the correct share. Do we need to think about how does technology play into that share? What inputs are we including? What production methods do that impact it? How are we going to determine all of that? Some people argue that this may not be as competitive of a return as a regular cash rent. So that can be another issue. So we've talked about 2 of the 3 types of leases. And like I said, there's some positive and negatives to both. The final type of lease that we see is the flexible cash lease. And with the flexible cash lease, this is one when I started an extension about 16 years ago, we were just starting to hear people discuss it. And it kind of grew out of the fact that had been several years in a row that farmers had had a really good year. And so they started giving bonuses, essentially, to the landlord. And they'd had a really good year, and they gave them an extra $200. Another really good year and gave another $200. And another year, another $200. And it got to me in the point where some of the landlords really expected it. And then all of a sudden, the tenants weren't giving them bonuses because prices didn't do so hot. And so they were like, well, why didn't I get my bonus this year? And so a flexible lease kind of allows for some of that to happen, but not be so up in the air on if it would happen. Essentially, with a flexible lease, what would happen is the tenant is going to pay all costs except the land ownership cost, so very similar to a regular cash lease. The landowner will pay the land ownership cost, but the rent amount is going to vary based on price, yield, or gross revenue, depending on how you decide to do this. And so it kind of takes some of the advantages of a cash lease and a crop share lease and smushes them together. So what you would do, and it does take a lot of discussion, but you would sit down, the tenant and landlord, and you would set what we call a base rent. And that base rent has to be less than what a cash rent would be. So if a typical cash rent would be $200 per acre, then our base rent for a flexible lease would be under $200. So maybe it's $150. And then you would decide how you're going to flex it. So the landlord is guaranteed that $150, that base rent, and then say you're flexing it on price. So if price is high and it's higher than the base that you may say the price has to be, they may get a bonus essentially on top of that $150. Or if the yield is higher than what you guys set, then they can get a bonus. The problem with this is that it can be really complicated. You do have to do a lot of record keeping, and you have to make sure that you come up with fair terms. Because like I said, it could be based on price, it could be based on yield, it could be based on gross revenue. If you're doing it on price, then the questions are that you need to answer range from the price on what day, the price from what elevator, or is it the price from the Chicago board? And is it the price in November or the price in December? So all of that has to be set and agreed upon. If it's going to be yield, do we take the yield from the yield monitor or do we estimate it? Or do we do it this way? So all of that has to be specified and clearly defined. So that's where that extra layer of record keeping is really important. These are growing in popularity. We're seeing more as some of the farm managers lean towards this. And so we're seeing more and more of it. I'm having more farmers reach out asking for resources on this. I will say Iowa State does a really good publication that lists all the different ways you can flex a lease. And I'm sure even though they've got, I don't know, 30, 40 different ways, there's probably even more out there. But that was kind of like the go-to one when all these were starting to get developed. So I did want to share this. This is a nice little reason. Oh, go ahead.
Where did you say who published had a really good resource? I'm sorry, I couldn't tell if it was Iowa State or Ohio State.
Iowa.
Iowa
It's
State.
Iowa State. And I can send that document to you guys. So, um, so let's see. This little screenshot is something I like to share. This is also out of Iowa. Or no, this is out of Nebraska, sorry. And it kind of shows like the amount of risk versus the returns, depending on if you're the landlord or the tenant. And so let me get my little cursor here. So on the bottom, the further to the right we get, the greater the amount of risk someone's taking on. And then with our y-axis, the higher up it gets, the more financial return. So if we look at like a cash rent, the very first one I said, it's right here. So if you're the landlord, you're not taking on very much risk, but you're not necessarily getting the best financial return either. It just depends on how willing you are to take on that risk. Whereas if you are the tenant and you're looking at cash rent, it's actually up here in this blue area. That's when the tenant's taking on the most amount of risk, but they're going to get the best returns, potentially, depending on how the market's going and the yield's going and everything. So it kind of compares them on which end of the spectrum they are. You can see the flexible leases. Let's see, we'll go green for flexible. It's kind of right here in the middle for both of them to some degree. They're both taking on some risk. They're both getting somewhat different financial returns. So I could go here for the landlord, here for the tenant. So it's a little closer, and the same with the crop share. It really just depends on how much risk the tenant and the landlord are really able to take on. But I think this is a nice little diagram just to think about and kind of think about where the different individuals might be willing to be on the spectrum in terms of how much risk they're willing to take. Let's see. There are the drawings, so we'll close that. All right, so just a few things on some common components of an agreement. Like I said earlier, we always stress putting everything in writing. These are kind of the typical things that we would see in an agreement, listing the parties involved, the property, the time period of the lease. So is it a 1 year, is it 2 years, a 3 year? The rental amount and the payment. So renewal, how is that going to be handled? Is it negotiated every 2 years? When does renewal notice need to be given? Land use, that could say that they're allowed to do corn and beans, a rotation, but no wheat, depending on what you might want, as an example. So operation and maintenance provision and just some general terms. One of the questions we do get, and I will show you this in a few minutes when we go over the resources, but we do get questions about, do you have like at least we can use? And Purdue doesn't necessarily have a release that we say, hey, this is the one to go use. However, I will say that there is a resource developed by several extension service across North Central United States, and they do have a example lease that you can kind of use and tailor. Leases don't have to be super long. They can be relatively short. You just have to make sure you get enough detail in there to work for your individual situation. And we do sometimes recommend getting an attorney and letting them peruse it at least once, maybe, just to make sure, if you're at all nervous about it. Again, we always do push for the written leases, not the verbal leases, just because our lives are so complicated. We don't want to leave things up to confusion and surprise accidents that can happen, like someone passing away. Some other things that you may want to include in your lease, if you're doing a flexible cash rent, how is the lease going to be flexed? So writing out the formula that you're going to use, specifying where, if you're doing it on price, who's getting the price, at what day, at what elevator or what source. Stuff about yield data. How's capital improvements going to be handled? Traditionally, that's usually the landlord, but for some cases, capital improvements are paid by tenants if it's going to be a longer term lease, so that the tenant benefits from those capital improvements. And if there's a chance they may not benefit from the improvements, how are they going to be compensated for putting the money in for that improvement but not getting all the benefits back? That can be spelled out in the lease. Soil tests. You can specify how often you want soil tests done. Conservation. So we'll talk more about that, but you can specify some information about how you want conservation handled in your lease. And then arbitration, if an issue arises, how are you going to handle that issue? Will you get a third party involved to help? Will you seek legal counsel? Those are all important things to include. So like I said, I do always try to incorporate conservation when I do this talk so that everyone is aware that you can incorporate conservation into your leases. And so there are a number of ways you can do them. One of the basic ones is to put a good husbandry clause. And essentially a good husbandry clause says we will do the best that we can do doing good agricultural practices. There's actually some more wording to it, but I can't remember it off the top of my head. But it's very generic, and it doesn't really specify. So it's almost like putting a statement like, we want to do something, but we're really not sure what we want to do. But if we do something, we're doing good. Well, we hope that you'd move past a good husbandry provision and actually put something in writing that might actually help and define what you're going to do. Kind of like how we talked about those SMART goals, giving you an objective, something to measure and make improvements with. So the next level up would be working with NRCS to maybe have a conservation plan, maybe doing some land use provisions. So saying that we're not going to farm so many feet near a waterway, or we're going to try to have every 5th year or something, we're going to just do cover crops and kind of let the land rest for a year. Or we're going to maybe put wheat into the rotation. Threshold and monitoring is specifying in that lease that maybe we're going to do something like monitor the soil every so often, so every 2 years. And if one of the levels gets below a certain point, then we have to take steps to improve that level of fertility. Or, maybe we're going to monitor or do some type of way of checking for soil erosion. Conservation provisions, that could be anything from maybe saying we're going to incorporate cover crops, or we're going to, any of the other things I've said. So there's a number of ways you can incorporate it in there. It's just a matter of discussing it and working with the tenant and the landlord together to find out what would be good to reach the goals of having that good husbandry clause, but actually specifying it out, kind of like we did with the SMART goals last week. One thing that's important when you're incorporating conservation into lease is to make sure that you have agreed upon the practices and the cost and how they're going to be split up in advance. That kind of goes back to, like I said, those long-term improvements. Like if you're adding lime, if the tenant pays for the lime and they don't get all the benefits for it, how are they going to be compensated for that unexhausted part? Or if the tenant, you know, pays to have the grass waterway put in or the tile drainage, it probably takes more than 1 year to really get the benefits of those. And so if the tenant pays for them, how are they going to be compensated for that improvement that they made into the landowner's land? And so having those discussions is really important to have them agreed upon early before any of the work is done to actually put that conservation practice into effect. So like I said, I did want to kind of switch gears and talk a little bit about pasture leases. So with pasture leases, they are challenging to negotiate. It's kind of up in the air because it depends a lot on supply and demand for the land. You do have to kind of calculate some different ways on how to do it, and I will show you some options in a few minutes. But you have to be aware of like stocking rates. So how many animals can really fit in that acre. You also have to make sure that you talked about how you're going to provide water, who's paying for the water, if it's on a municipal water source. Are you keeping the livestock out of a creek or a pond? Who's going to repair the fences? Who's going to do a variety of different things that needs to be done. And all of that has to be really discussed. Is a barn included? Discussed early on, and it can kind of be part of that negotiation process. So if you're not familiar, stocking rates is the animal density on a specified parcel of land. It can be expressed as a number of animals or in terms of animal units. A lot of times we see this as a cow with calf as being one animal equivalent unit, and then they go off of there. A lot of times we see it mostly with cattle as how it's expressed. And so it plays into some of the formulas out there that you can use to calculate. And like I said, I will show you some of those formulas in a few minutes. And this says general reminder for pasture leases, but it goes with any lease really. No one lease fits all. You do always have to negotiate it for your individual situation because there are a variety of things that can adjust a lease. We talk a lot sometimes about tenants that go above and beyond what the lease says, like, do they come and plow your driveway? Well, take that into consideration when you are negotiating that lease. If you're going to get the benefit of your driveway being plowed when there's a foot of snow, that's important. Or are they going to help mow the ditch around your field? That's important if you want your property to look great. Also, think about the size of the land. A lot of our equipment are getting larger, and so we need fields that we can get the equipment in. Some people just can't do those small fields anymore. So, always realize that every lease can be negotiated to fit, and what works for one tenant-landlord relationship may not work for another. On the pasture side, some things to keep in mind: location. How close are you to it? Is it easy for you to go check your animals, or are you going to have to depend on the landlord or landowner to check your animals? And like I said earlier, water can be a big one too. So I've talked a lot tonight about negotiation and talking and making sure you have things written down. And that's because really a lot of what boils down for a land lease is based around communication. And so we always try to incorporate a little bit on communication when we do a land lease discussion. And so communication is what really builds trust. Having a good relationship between a landlord and tenant is really important. You need to understand each other's values and goals so that you can build on that lease and make sure that each parties are clearly represented by that lease. When you're trying to build trust, make sure you're giving the topic at hand your full attention. Listen to what is being said. Check for accuracy. So, ask that follow-up question. I hear you're saying this. Is this what you mean? Things like that should be asked. Keep an open mind. Keep a sense of humor. Remember, put yourself in their shoes as you're negotiating that lease and build that trust. I've really said it multiple times, oral communication is important, giving that update throughout the year, hand delivering that rent check, that's great, but written communication is crucial. So making sure you have it in writing, your lease. Don't rely solely on an oral agreement. Yes, they are legal in the state of Indiana, but that's where we have a lot of issues come about. And not all landlords want a lot of oral communication or want a lot of written communication. So realize that some landlords may want extra communication. Some, they're okay if you only talk to them once a year, or twice a year. But, it's good to have a relationship with them outside of just negotiation time. Because if they feel like you've really tried to get to know them a little bit and you support them and, you're part of one big community, that can help, as things develop. And, if there's a year when you kind of have to have that awkward conversation and say, hey, I really need to adjust the rent and can we lower it? If you have that trust and a relationship with them, they may be more willing to do that. So like I said, it really does depend on the landowner on how often you want to communicate. We always suggest at least 2 to 3 times. Talk to the landlord, find out what they expect. And one thing, of course, don't leave any issues unaddressed if there's something lingering in the background, because that can stir issues up later on. I do like to share this that there are some farmers who like to do like an end of the year report. And we always say we want to kind of develop something like this where kind of like a template where you can put like what crops were planted, a little bit of information about the land, production notes, your plans for next year, and kind of give it as an end of the year report when you're paying the rent to kind of educate the landlord about what the property did. Again, I know some people don't want to share their exact yields, but if you could say like, hey, the average has been this over the last 5 years, that gives them an idea. And it's just sharing that knowledge, because we're finding more and more of the landlords may not have ever really been in farming, and they're trying to negotiate rent and they've never seen the ground, or if they have seen the ground, they really don't have any clue what's there. And it's hard for them to understand that not every piece of ground has that great, perfect, dark, rich soil. That we have soil that's kind of poor and doesn't necessarily produce the best crops. So anything you can do to help educate them is really important. And I think in the long run, most would appreciate it. Some things to think about if you're working with a new landowner, try to build that relationship, like I said. Ask questions about the history of the land. Guys owned it very long. Do you know much about what's happened in there? You can ask about prior leases. Some may talk about it, some may not. Ask them what their expectations are. Do they expect you to clean out the driveway? Some do, some don't. And then ask them how often they want you to check in. If you're a landowner working with tenants, we always recommend a new tenant. We always recommend that you try to build a relationship. Ask about the tenant's production practices. Tell them what your expectations are, and don't be afraid to ask questions. Most tenants are more than willing to help educate, especially when we have those new landlords that maybe don't know much about farming. I've kind of already talked on most of this about, if you're working with an absentee landowner, they typically have more questions. Um, you might want to ask them how often they want to know stuff. If they're really absent, but they still want to know some, you might send them photos, and things like that. Just really depends on their interest and your availability. But really, just the more you can build relationships and help educate, the better off I think you would be. Based off of the questions that we tend to get in extension from the absentee landowners. Because, like I said, they call and they're like, I know nothing about the land. Some will say, I've never even seen it, but I've inherited it. And now I think it's, I looked at this and I think my rent should be this, and I'm only getting, half of that. And it's like, well, where did you get that first number? And do you know what type of soil is in the area? So, those are some things to consider. The more you can educate someone, the better. Okay, so that is all I have for the PowerPoint. But like I said, I want to show you guys some different resources. And so I'm going to share a different screen. And so the first resource I'm going to share with you is Ag Lease 101. This is the website that I said was kind of developed by several different extension services across North Central United States. So that does include Indiana. And it's so nice because they have this document library. And when you go down to the document library, they have publications on fixed and flexible lease arrangements, crop share. They have a pasture rental agreement. So I'm going to go ahead and click that one. They're all free. Most of them were recently updated. Sorry, Purdue updated our computers and the Acrobat thing's a little weird. But you can read through it and it'll talk to you about different ways to establish the rent. You can do it based on the landowner's cost, livestock owner's net return, cash lease, share of the gain, variable rates. It's just got a lot of great information that you can use. And they have example worksheets in here that you can adjust for your individual situation. So this is a great one if you're looking for examples on that pasture side of things. And I showed you the pasture one. Oops. But the same thing exists for a cash lease or for buildings. There's tons of different information. So that's on the left-hand side with the lease publications. There's also these lease forms. And so when someone asks, do you have an example land lease? I can share this with them as a starting point. And it gives you a lease that they can fill out and use, or at least use to get started. And I can tell they've even updated this within the last 3 years to where it's got some more information in here that you can fill out. But it's a great resource and a good starting point for anyone that's working towards a written lease that doesn't know where to start. And if you don't need a statement about to remove fallen trees and branches on the property and not to remove live trees if you don't need that statement in there, you can, exit out or delete it because this is just the starting point. But it's a great resource that most people don't know exists that I think is really important to share with you guys. The other resources I wanted to share focus on that going rate question that we get. And there's 2 typical sources of information that we always recommend. And so the first one, sorry, my little screen covered up so I can't reach it, is the Purdue Agricultural Economics Report. So every August, Purdue releases their Purdue Agricultural Economics report that focuses on farmland values and cash rent based on their survey. So you can find it off the Center Commercial Ag website, but you can click here to view the full report. And I'm sure this has to be like one of Purdue's top publications that's ever downloaded. And I'm going to click here to get the full report in an easier version. And you can see I've had it open recently because this is a top question we get in the office. The survey is done annually. It's done usually in June and July. In August, they publish the results. When I first started in Extension, they provided results for row crop, for pasture, and for hay ground. Unfortunately, the number of responses for pasture and hay ground has decreased, so they only do row crops. And they do also land transitioning out of ag and into more urban uses or recreation uses. But they get the information from farm managers, extension educators, a variety of different sources. But they group all the land into different areas. And so, Putnam is right here in West Central, Montgomery, Tippecanoe, I think it's White. We're all right through here. We've got Central. But you can look at it and see which region you're in. I do always say, if you're close to a region, like here in Putnam, we're close to Central, Southeast, and Southwest. Look at West Central, but also look at Southwest, Southeast, Central, because, we may have ground that's closer to down here than necessarily some of the ground that's way up here. But they provide a table. This is the one for land value, so that's a nice one. But we're going to slide on down. And here we get into land rent. And let's see, there we go. To land rent. And so if we use that West Central example, it breaks all of the land into different land classes, top, average, and poor. And you can see the bushels per acre for corn production because everything's based on corn production. And so if a person would call and ask me in the office, well, what's the going rate? I pull this up and I try to explain them how we're grouped together. And then I say, okay, now if you kind of bushel per acre that's around 180, you're probably looking at kind of the poor quality land or 210s average, top 240, because again, these are averages. And then we can talk about the rent per acre. And it gives you last year's number and this year's number. So in West Central, if you were looking at poor quality land, oops, sorry, my computer just adjusted on me. And I was not ready for that. Okay, if we were looking at poor quality land, that'd be this row right here that I'm highlighting. The rent per acre for 2025 on average was 239 bushels per acre. Or dollars per acre, sorry, $239 per acre. That's up 3.59% from 2024. In 2024, it was $231 per acre. That's on a rent per acre. If you know your bushels, you could do it as in terms of dollars per bushel. And so for 2025, the rent per bushel of corn was $1.33 per bushel. That's this column right here. So that's one way to look at it. Again, I always stress that these are averages, and I always try to give them a range. So I tell them what the poor is, the average, and the top quality. We have been talking more about trying to use it as a dollar per bushel of rent instead of a rent per acre, just because you can narrow it down then closer to what your farm is if you know the production information. Again, they have them per every area of the state. They also give Indiana as a whole down at the bottom. Now, there are some issues with the Purdue Ag Economics Report. Those issues kind of range from the fact that, people may not be trustworthy in what they report when they fill out the survey. We're also grouping several counties together. So, like I said, for Putnam, we're grouped with some really high quality soil counties. And so, there are some issues with it. So this is just one source of information. The other one that I want to mention is the National Ag Statistics Service. So once you go onto their website, you can select your state. So we'll go to Indiana here. And then we go to, I'm trying to remember, I think it's county estimates. And they do cash rent. The last one they have up is 2024, so we'll pull it up. Again, they have them in regions, but there's no region value here. They actually do it per county. We are going to slide down to West Central because that's where Putnam is for the example. And so if we follow Putnam across, they say on average in 2024, land rent was $238 per bushel, or dollars per acre, sorry, $238 per acre. And that's for non-irrigated land. The next column over is irrigated land. Putnam doesn't have irrigated land. And then the far column over is pasture land. Again, you can see irrigated and pasture, they don't have a lot of information out there. This is another tool in the toolbox when trying to negotiate rent. It has flaws just like the Purdue Agricultural Economics Report. This one only gives you one number. It doesn't give you a range. What numbers are getting reported? Is everyone telling the truth? If you're a farmer and you're reporting, you may want to report your lower numbers to help drive the prices down. If you're a landlord reporting, you probably want to put your higher numbers in so you can get higher rent. So, and then there's these areas that don't have numbers that may actually have some irrigation in it, or they have pasture rent. So there are some issues with it, but it is some of the best resources that we do have available at this point in time. So I know I threw a ton of stuff at you. What questions do you have at this point over land leases?
How do you have that conversation with the landlord that lives in Florida and pulls up Purdue and says, well, I think my land is great. We're going to go for the $399 an acre, when they have heavy deer population, they have their yield is not anywhere near that. How do you have that conversation? I guess, is there resources out there for how to tell them, hey, it's not exactly accurate? It's
hard. Okay. It is. It's building that relationship. So, if you have a way of showing the damage from the deer, showing that to them. If you have a way of sharing averages on the yield, trying to explain to them, this is what the yield monitor has been showing, or, it's not something that's going to be solved overnight. It's going to be a continual education and trying to build their trust and explain to them that, hey, we really do like farming this ground, but there are some issues that are associated with it. I don't know, Karen, do you have any other thoughts on that one?
No, I don't have any helpful thoughts. I mean, you're right. It is a hard conversation to have, but when that landlord is so far removed from the farm and really has no clue, sometimes the best thing you can do is let somebody else step in and agree to pay that higher rent or meet their needs, because you always have to protect yourself at the end of the day.
Yeah. And that's true. But good question.
I've seen Randy watches a ton of ag videos, and I've seen where there are farmers literally like grading different things, and population of deer is one, things like that, and closeness to their farm, and they're like, no, it's not worth this cost. The cost to put the crop out is not worth the cost of everything else. And so literally went to landlords, and landlords were like, well, what do you mean you want to leave me? Well, I can't keep you, and nothing you can do can make me want to stay because I can't get what I need. So
Yep. Any other questions or comments?
sorry I was late.
You're fine. It is recorded,
Okay.
and everything. I don't know exactly when you jumped in, if you heard me or not. Either I messed up or NRCS messed up. I don't know. I thought she was doing it today. She's going to do it next week. So next week will be farm insurance. So like grain bins, stuff like that type of insurance. And then it will be NRCS
Okay.
as the next one.
Bonus, you are this person, so it made it easy. You could just slide right in.
Yeah. That was kind of the last minute. Oh, at 2:30, she's like, I thought I was next week. And I'm like, oh, we'll go with that. I'm guessing you told me and I made the change on the schedule, and then the schedule didn't save right. So that was an easy fix. But I will edit the recording and send it to you so you guys can watch it again if you want. I'll also send you a link to that Iowa State publication that I mentioned. So,
Okay.
Awesome.
all right. If you have questions between now and then, feel free to let me know. But thanks for joining tonight.